Someone in your life is winning right now. It could be a promotion, a relationship, or a moment of recognition that you wanted for yourself. That feeling can either inspire you or eat you alive. If it's the latter, today we're turning envy from a kindness killer into a signal that can literally change the course of your life. Welcome to the Kindness Extremist Podcast. I'm your host, Shola Richards, aka Brother Teresa. I've spoken to tens of thousands of people all over the world about the importance of kindness. And I am obsessed with how we can bring more kindness into our daily lives and restore balance to a deeply unbalanced world. Every episode, I'll give you 3 practical strategies to create a kinder world, and I'll do it in 30 minutes or less. No fluff, just valuable, actionable content that you can implement in your life immediately after listening to help you actively create a kinder world. There's no time to waste. Let's dive in. What's up, my friend? Welcome back to episode 64 of the Kindness Extremist Podcast. I'm your host, Shola Richards, aka Brother Teresa. And as a reminder, if you're not already, please make sure to follow me on Substack at Shola Richards. That's substack.com. And if you're enjoying this podcast, the best way to support this work is to leave a rating and a review. Both are deeply appreciated. I want to open today's episode with a confession. I'm going to need you not to judge me too harshly for it, because what I'm about to admit is probably something that people would rather carry silently to their graves than say out loud on a podcast. So several years into building my speaking and writing career, a colleague of mine, someone I knew, someone I even cheered for publicly, started to receive major media coverage for their work. I'm talking like network morning show appearances, cited in well-known publications, being interviewed for A-list podcasts, basically the kind of visibility that in our world means things are about to change for you in a very serious way. And when I heard the news, I hate to say this, but my first reaction was not joy. It wasn't even neutral. My first reaction, and I'm talking about the one that happened in a half a second before I had a chance to supervise it, was a tight, hot, unmistakable flicker of something that I didn't want to name. Something that said, why them and not me? Something that immediately started doing the calculations in my head about why I deserved it more. Something that if I let it run for very long, was going to start hunting for flaws in this person's work so I could feel better about the gap between their trajectory and mine. That feeling was envy, and I was beating myself up for feeling that way. Now, looking back on it, that reaction didn't make me a bad person, but if I had let that feeling linger around for longer than necessary and I fed it rather than examined it, it would have made me a less kind one. Because envy, left unexamined and unaddressed, is one of the most destructive forces that exist in the human mind. It does not announce itself loudly. It doesn't wear a villain costume. It disguises itself as righteous frustration or as discernment or as total reasonable assessment of someone else's undeserved success. And while it's wearing that disguise, it is slowly poisoning our capacity for genuine connection, for generous celebration, and for the kind of courageous, outward-directed kindness that this podcast is built around. So today, we're going to address this issue directly, because any issue that makes us doubt ourselves while also making us root against other people is something that's worth our honest attention. You know how we roll on this podcast, fam. 3 parts, 3 strategies, and a kinder world will be waiting for us on the other side. Let's do this. Let me start by saying something that I genuinely believe will change how you relate to envy if you'll let it. Envy is not necessarily evidence that you're a petty, small, or ungenerous person. Envy is information. It is an inner signal about what you actually want and don't yet have, and about the gap between where you are and where some part of you believes you deserve to be. Still though, that obviously doesn't make envy harmless, because it usually isn't. What you do with that information matters enormously, and we're going to get into that momentarily, so hang tight. But I want to start here with this reframe, because the shame spiral that most people fall into the moment they notice envious feelings in themselves is actually one of the main things that prevent them from actually using envy productively. Not that you need me to tell you this, but you can't examine a feeling that you're too ashamed to admit having. Social psychologists who study envy have found something interesting. There are actually 2 meaningfully different kinds of envy. The first is what researchers call malicious envy. It is what people commonly think of when they think of envy. It's the kind of envy that wants to pull the other person down, the kind that finds itself actually relieved, or worse, excited when the other person stumbles, and the kind that measures its own worth by whether the gap between you and the other person is actually closing. The second is what they call benign envy, the kind that hurts because you want what they have, but that translates into motivation rather than resentment. The kind that says, I want to be where they are and I'm going to work toward getting there. Malicious envy obviously is a kindness killer. It's a version that makes you less generous, less celebratory, and less able to show up fully for the people around you because in your head, you're engaged in a competition that nobody else signed up for. Benign envy, on the other hand, can actually serve you if you're willing to be honest enough to sit with it rather than shame yourself out of it. And the difference between which kind of envy takes root in you is largely determined by one thing: whether you treat the feeling as a compass or as a verdict. A compass points you somewhere. It gives you information about a direction. When envy functions as a compass, it's telling you something true and important about your own desires, your own values, and the distance between where you are and where you genuinely want to be. That information is worth having. A verdict, on the other hand, is a judgment. And when envy functions as a verdict, it's telling you a story about your worth relative to someone else's. That story, I can promise you, never ends well, is almost never accurate, and is always corrosive. Unfortunately, I'm very familiar with malicious envy. Whether it was when one of my buddies in college started dating the girl that I had a crush on forever, my colleague landed the promotion before I did, or even when a neighbor pulled into her driveway driving my dream car, I felt it. What I felt was the verdict that I was not good looking enough, not qualified enough, or just not enough, period. What I didn't do in those instances way back when was sit with the envy, look at it like a compass, and honestly ask what it was actually pointing to. Keeping it real, this has been a journey for me, and I'm excited to share how I've overcome this issue. And with that said, here's the first kindness strategy of this episode. I want you to practice what I call the envy admission. Here's how this works. So think about the last time you felt a flicker of envy towards someone. Maybe it was someone whose career is moving faster than yours, someone whose relationship was more joyful than what you're experiencing, someone whose body, house, recognition, or life circumstances trigger that uncomfortable feeling of wanting what they have. Shaming yourself is not allowed in this exercise. All I want you to do is sit with it honestly. Now I want to ask 3 questions about that moment. First, what specifically triggered the feeling? The more specific you can be, the more useful this becomes. Second, what desire is the envy pointing to that you haven't been fully honest with yourself about? And third, is this feeling functioning as a compass or a verdict? Meaning, is it directing you towards something you want to pursue like a compass, or is it causing you to become judgy about the other person? Or worse, is it telling yourself a story about your relative worth like a verdict? The envy admission is not a comfortable exercise, but it is incredibly useful because envy that gets named, examined, and redirected stops being a kindness killer and starts being a useful guide. And I can tell you from personal experience, envy that gets shamed into silence doesn't disappear. It just goes underground where it does its most destructive work. Okay, let's talk about the engine that powers most modern envy, because we cannot have this conversation honestly without addressing it directly. That engine is comparison, and we are living in the most comparison-saturated environment in the history of human civilization. In episode 42, we talked about how social media is like rewiring our brain in ways that are genuinely dangerous. And one of the most specific and damaging things it does is create what I think of as the comparison loop, a constant, never-ending cycle of measuring your interior life against other people's highlight reels. Your sad and lonely Tuesday eating cereal for dinner versus their vacation photos. Your crappy kitchen with the broken dishwasher versus the renovation reveal. Your ordinary Wednesday versus their promotion announcement. And here is what the research on social comparison tells us consistently. This loop doesn't just make us feel bad temporarily, it reshapes how we evaluate ourselves. Psychologists studying what's called upward social comparison, comparing ourselves to people we perceive as doing better than us, have found that when it becomes habitual, it erodes our baseline sense of satisfaction within our own lives, even when those lives are objectively going well. We don't experience our lives in a vacuum. We experience them in relation to what we believe other people's lives look like. And when that reference point that we're comparing ourselves to is an endlessly curated stream of other people's best moments, we are rigging the comparison game against ourselves from the jump. What makes this especially insidious in the context of kindness is that the comparison loop doesn't just hurt you, it affects how you show up for the people who you're comparing yourself to. So I want to be very real with you about what happened after the initial flash of envy that I described in the intro of this episode. The reason it threatened to become something so much worse that I let the comparison loop run, instead of sitting with the feeling and examining it the way we talked about just previously, I kept returning to it. I would check my colleagues' social media. I'd mentally revisit my own track record and try to build a case for why I was equally deserving. I would compare our timelines, our platforms, our audiences. And every time I did that, the gap felt worse. And my capacity to genuinely celebrate this person, someone whose work I actually admired, diminished a little bit more. The comparison loop feeds envy in the way that oxygen feeds a fire. And once it gets going, it is genuinely hard to stop because the brain's reward system gets hooked on the intermittent hits of feeling either superior when a comparison goes your way or the compulsive return to the thing that's making you feel bad. Both of those are real, sadly addictive, and both are sincerely not good for your soul. Trust me on this. The only way to break that loop is to deliberately and consciously interrupt it. Not once, not when you feel ready, but every time you notice it starting. So one of my professional speaker buddies, I'll call him Andre, has built a thriving business over the past 4 years. He is so good at his work, has a loyal community of followers. However, Andre had one person he followed on social media, another professional speaker with an adjacent speaking topic to his, whose numbers were significantly larger than his. Every time this person posted a milestone, Andre felt it. And every time he felt it, he went to go check his own numbers, which somehow always seemed more disappointing after looking at someone else's. What Andre eventually realized was that he was voluntarily stepping into the comparison loop every single day, multiple times a day, and then wondering why he felt deflated and defeated. The answer was in his hands. Literally, he made one decision that changed everything. He unfollowed the account. Not because the person was doing anything wrong, not because Andre wished them ill, but because the specific comparison that account triggered in him was not useful. It was not functioning as a compass. It was functioning as a source of recurring pain that was eroding his own joy in his work and genuine warmth towards a person in his space. Unfollowing wasn't petty. It wasn't small. It was an act of self-knowledge and self-management that made Andre a kinder, more present, and more generally useful voice to his own community. And on that note, here's the second kindness strategy of the episode. I want you to practice what I call the comparison fast. Here's how it works. For the next 7 days, I want you to identify and deliberately interrupt every comparison thought you notice. Not suppress it, notice it. This is critical. When you catch yourself measuring your progress against someone else's, your relationship against someone else's, your body or your home or your career against someone else's, I want you to do 3 things in sequence. First, name it out loud or in writing. For example, I'm in the comparison loop right now. Just naming it breaks the automatic nature of it. Second, ask the compass question. Is this comparison giving me useful information about what I want, or is it just making me feel worse? If it's useful, sit with it and do the envy admission that we mentioned earlier. If it's hurting you, deliberately redirect. And third, redirect to what I call a gratitude anchor. One specific thing that is genuinely good about your own life or work right now. Not to bypass the feeling, not to pretend the comparison doesn't sting, but to give your brain an alternative track to run on. For the social media dimension specifically, audit the accounts you follow and ask yourself honestly which ones leave you feeling inspired and which ones leave you feeling diminished. Inspired is worth keeping. Consistently diminished is worth releasing. You are not required to consume content that is functionally a comparison loop that you are trying to convince yourself is a form of motivation. Doing so is a form of self-inflicted kindness deprivation. The comparison fast isn't about pretending that comparison doesn't happen, but getting faster at recognizing it, quicker at redirecting it, and more deliberate about the environments you're choosing to put yourself in because the loop only runs as long as you keep stepping into it. Hey, fellow kindness extremists, it's me, Shola. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, if you're mowing what I'm growing, if you're smelling what I'm stepping in. Okay, I'll stop. If you're enjoying what you're listening to so far, I would love it if you would take a moment to hit the subscribe button and leave a rating and a review. Those incredibly kind acts go so far in helping me to reach as many people as possible who will join the movement to actively create a kinder world. I appreciate you so much, my friend. Okay, let's get back to the episode. Okay, family, we've named what envy actually is. We talked about how to break the comparison loop that fuels it. Now I want to talk about what I believe is the single most powerful antidote to envy that exists. And I want to warn you up front, it's going to sound counterintuitive and possibly even impossible if you're deep in the grip of it, but stick with me on this. The antidote to envy is not less awareness of other people's success. It is not the protective indifference. It is not the ability to scroll past someone's good news without feeling anything. The antidote to envy is genuine celebration. I know what you're thinking right now. Shola, that's easy to say. How am I supposed to genuinely celebrate the person whose success is triggering my own inadequacy? I hear you, family. I get it. I'm not going to pretend that this is easy, especially in the beginning, but I want to make a case why it works. And then I want to give you a practical path to do this. First, here's what the psychological research on gratitude, generosity, and what some call pro-social behavior consistently shows. When we actively invest in celebrating other people's wins, not performatively, but genuinely, something real shifts in our own interior. Our sense of scarcity diminishes. The unconscious zero-sum story that says their win is my loss begins to lose its grip. We start to experience the abundance of other people's good fortune as evidence that good fortune is possible, including our own. There's a concept that I found deeply useful here. Psychologists and relationship researchers have studied what happens when people practice what's sometimes called active constructive responding, or in other words, responding to someone else's good news with genuine, specific, enthusiastic engagement rather than passive acknowledgement or deflection. Doing this consistently not only strengthens relationships, it also has the power to increase the well-being of the person doing the responding. In other words, when you genuinely celebrate someone else, you don't just give them something, you receive something too. This is not just a nice idea. This is a powerful reversal of the logic of envy. So let me go back to my own story because I owe you the ending of it. So let's get to it. So after that initial flash of envy when my colleague received all that media attention, I started to do some research, like how do you combat this envy feeling? And I found out some information that I decided to give a try, and I'm going to share with you now. I made a decision that felt unnatural and slightly absurd. I reached out to congratulate them. Not with a quick congrats, not with a text that took 2 seconds to send. I wrote them a genuine message. I told them specifically what I admire about their work. I told them the attention was earned and that I was glad that the world would be having better access to what they had to say. And here's what happened. The envy actually dissolved. Not completely, not immediately, and not without small recurring flickers happening later on, but the specific hot flash that's been threatening to become uglier dissipated almost entirely in the act of genuinely celebrating this person. Because envy feeds on separation, the us versus them story that turns someone else's win into a threat to yours. And genuine celebration dissolves that separation. You cannot simultaneously celebrate someone with your whole heart and resent them. You just can't do it. The two states are neurologically and emotionally incompatible. There's something else that I want to name here that I think is important, and it connects back to everything we've been building on this podcast, which is really, really important. The capacity to celebrate other people generously is not just a nice personal quality, it's a direct measure of your inner security. The more genuinely you can cheer for someone else without it threatening your own sense of your own worth, the more you have done the inner work that is critical in creating a kinder world. And the people who struggle the most with envy are almost always the people who have tied their sense of worth to external comparison. If I'm worth something only relative to others, then their success is a threat. But if my worth is not contingent on finishing ahead of anyone, then their win genuinely doesn't cost me anything. In fact, it actually gives me something. Evidence that if good things are possible for them, then those blessings are possible for me too. That is abundance thinking, and it's not a personality type. It's a practice, which means that it can be built. So here's the third and final kind of strategy of this episode. I want you to practice what I call the celebration practice. I've actually mentioned this one in a previous episode, and it's worth bringing back for an encore. Here's how this works. So this week, I want you to identify one person whose recent success has triggered any amount of envy in you. It could be a colleague, a peer in your industry, a friend, someone you follow online, and I want you to actively, specifically, and generously celebrate them. Not a passive like on their post, not a quick reply. I mean a real celebration. Reach out directly. Tell them something specific that you admire about their work or their journey. Ask a question that communicates genuine interest. Treat their win as if you're a close friend who had been rooting for them, even if the truth is that you've been secretly rooting against them. This is going to feel uncomfortable. That's fine. Do it anyway. Because here's what I know from having done this myself and from watching other people do it too. The discomfort is not evidence that you're being inauthentic. It's evidence that you're practicing a capacity that hasn't been fully built yet. And every time you choose celebration over resentment, you're making a deposit into that version of yourself that genuinely does not need someone else to stumble in order for you to feel good about yourself. Now, let me add one more layer to this because I think it matters enormously. The celebration practice is not only for people who triggered your envy, it's a daily discipline for anyone whose good news crosses your path. Someone on your team gets recognized, celebrate it specifically and out loud. A friend shares something they're proud of, respond with active, genuine engagement, not just a polite nod and a subject change. A family member hits a milestone that you might have been privately measuring yourself against, be the loudest person in the room cheering for them. In episode 23 of this podcast, we talked about the appreciation crisis, the fact that most people are going through their lives profoundly under-celebrated. The celebration practice is one direct and powerful way to address that crisis. But it does something else too. It trains you out of the envy by training you into abundance. Every genuine celebration you offer is a vote for the world where other people's wins are not threats to you. A world where success is not a finite resource with a waiting list. A world where your goodness towards others does not diminish you, but expands you. This is the kind of world this podcast is trying to build. And as it turns out, defeating envy is one of the most direct paths to make that happen. Okay, my friend, let me bring this home. Today, we tackled one of the least discussed and most universally experienced forces that undermines kindness, envy. We didn't shame it. We didn't pretend it's rare or that only bad people feel it. We examined it honestly, named what it actually is, and built a practical path through it. So in part one, we distinguished between envy as a compass and as a verdict. And we talked about the difference between malicious envy, which tears down, and benign envy, which can actually point you somewhere useful if you're willing to examine what it's telling you. And we introduced the envy admission, 3 honest questions that convert an uncomfortable feeling into actionable self-knowledge. In part two, we named the comparison loop, the engine that keeps envy running in the modern world. And we talked about how to break it. We met Andre, who made the simple and courageous decision to stop voluntarily stepping into comparison that was not serving him. And we committed to the comparison fast, 7 days of naming, questioning, and redirecting every comparison thought and auditing the environments that are consistently triggering the loop. And finally, in part three, we made the case for what I believe is the single most powerful antidote to envy: genuine celebration, not as a performance, not as gritted teeth politeness, but as real practice, deliberately chosen investment in the wins of the people around us. We closed the celebration practice, reaching out this week to one person whose success has triggered any envy in you and celebrating them with the specific, generous, enthusiastic warmth that you would want someone to offer you when you win. I want to close with this. One of the things that I said in this podcast from the very beginning is that kindness requires strength, and that is not passive, not reflexive, and not easy. Today's episode, I think, is one of the clearest demonstrations of that. It takes real strength to look at your own envy honestly instead of burying it. It takes real strength to break a comparison loop that your brain is chemically inclined to keep running. And it takes real strength to genuinely celebrate someone when part of you would rather not do it. But here is the extraordinary thing about that strength. Every single time you exercise it, the envy gets a little smaller. The comparison loop gets a little easier to interrupt. The celebration gets a little more genuine and a little less effortful. You are literally rewiring your mind toward abundance rather than scarcity, toward generosity rather than resentment, toward the kind of expansive outward directive kindness that this podcast exists to build. Envy says there's not enough for both of us. Kindness says your win makes the world a better place and I'm glad to live in it. Choose kindness every single time, not because it's easy, but because you're strong enough to do it. This is your host, Shola Richards, aka Brother Teresa, and you now know that kindness can't be weak because you just experienced the strength of the Kindness Extremist podcast. Till next time, my friend, the journey to a kinder world continues. Thank you for listening to the Kindness Extremist podcast. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I have one favor to ask you. If you could kindly hit the subscribe button, leave a rating and a review, not only would that be incredibly kind, but by doing so, you're actively playing a role in growing this movement and ideally getting us one step closer to creating a kinder world. I hope to see you next week for another episode of the Kindness Extremist podcast. Bye for now.